Hello, and welcome to the Additional Needs Practitioner Self-Paced Program, Module 3, Making Sense of Our Senses. I'm Mark Arnold, and I look after additional needs work at Urban Saints. I'll be your guide as we go through this module together. We're going to split our time up into 3 sessions, and there'll be an opportunity to take a short break between each of the sessions. The first session is going to look at 5 of our better known senses: sight, hearing, smell, taste, and touch. And then there'll be an opportunity for you to respond to what we've learned together. In our second session, we'll unpack 3 mystery senses: our vestibular sense, all about balance and movement; proprioception, our body awareness; and then interoception, what's going on inside of our body and our awareness of that. And again, there'll be an opportunity to respond to what we've been looking at. In session 3, we'll have a look at sensory processing difficulties, bringing together much of what we've learned in the earlier sessions. And there are also some case studies for you to have a go at. Now, with all of the modules in the Additional Needs Practitioner self-paced program, there's an opportunity for you to find something that you can use as a fiddle or fidget to help you to focus and concentrate as we go through the session together. That's no more true than in this sensory focused training session, where we think about our own senses as well as the senses of the children and young people that we are journeying with. So if you need something to grab to use as a fidget or fiddle during these sessions, then pause the video for a couple of moments, get something you can use, and then restart it again. Okay, let's have a look at the first of the better known of our senses: sight, our visual sense. We can see on the graphic there are many ways in which that sense is used. Some children and indeed leaders in our groups may not have ever been able to see, or which is referred to as being blind, or have experienced partial or full sight loss, or have a visual impairment. There are many aspects to sight loss and blindness that we need to think about. If we have a child or leader in our group who is blind or who has experienced partial or full sight loss or is visually impaired, think about how to include them in the team. Here's 3 tips that can help you with that. First of all, make sure you speak to them regularly. They only know you're there if you are speaking to them and they can hear you clearly. Confirm that they understand what you've been saying. Use their name to help with that and for them to know that you're speaking to them. If appropriate, provide resources that they can use, such as in large print or in braille. If you're putting things up on a presentation slide, use large, clear fonts and don't put text in front of photos or videos as a background. Ask the children, young people, or leaders that you're journeying with what resources they might need and provide what's helpful for them. Have a bit of a check of your location, your building, the room you use to run children's, youth, and families work in. Make sure that there are no protruding signs. Those can be really dangerous for somebody with a visual impairment or who's blind. Make sure there aren't any trip hazards, trailing cables, or rugs that are a bit rucked up. Glass doors without signs can be particularly dangerous because people don't know that they're there. So think about putting a sign on the glass door to help people to be aware that there's a hazard in front of them. A great way of being able to work through with our group about what it might be like to be blind or visually impaired, whether that's referring them to the stories in the Gospels of Jesus interacting with blind people, or better yet, to understand their peers or leaders who may be visually impaired or blind themselves. Then Vine, Visually Impairment Northeast, have a brilliant pack, a simulation pack, which includes a set of glasses that gives an impression of different kinds of visual impairment. You can buy these, although the pack is quite expensive to purchase. But I understand that you can also hire them. And, if this is an area that's a particular focus for you, that might be a great activity to do with the group. In each of the areas that we're going to be looking at, we'll think about how Jesus interacted with people with different impairments, or how different senses were relevant to the stories that we read about Jesus. Here we hear about Bartimaeus, a man who's blind, who begged for a living on the road from Jericho to Jerusalem. And on this day, Jesus and all his followers are going by. They're on their way back to Jerusalem for the festival. It's actually the journey that takes Jesus to Palm Sunday. But here, as he goes past Bartimaeus hears the commotion, asks what's going on. Somebody tells him that it's Jesus and all his followers. And Bartimaeus calls out to Jesus and says, "Jesus, son of David, have mercy on me." Of course, the first thing that happens to Bartimaeus is the rest of the crowd shush him, tell him to be quiet, not to be a bother, to keep out of the way. Isn't that often what can happen to children, young people, or adults with additional needs and disabilities, even in our churches today? But Bartimaeus cried out again, and Jesus heard him and invited Bartimaeus to come to him. And there's Bartimaeus, a man who's blind, in front of Jesus, who's been going around teaching and preaching and healing people. The crowd gathered round expectantly, wanting to watch another of those amazing miracles that Jesus did. But Jesus then did something unexpected. And it's a really helpful teaching moment for us, because what Jesus did was to ask Bartimaeus a question. He said, "What would you have me do for you? What do you want me to do for you?" The crowd would have been astonished. "Well, it's Bartimaeus, he's blind. You've been going around healing people for the last several years." But Jesus didn't assume. He didn't decide on Bartimaeus' behalf what he wanted. He asked him. And that's a great teaching moment for us, something that we could all do, to remember to ask people, whether they're blind, visually impaired, or have other additional needs and disabilities, what they would have us do for them. Our second sense is our sense of hearing, our auditory sense. Again, on the screen, there's a graphic that gives you some thoughts about ways in which we use that sense. Some of the children or young people in our group may have never been able to hear, and they would be referred to as deaf. That's with a capital D. They will typically use British Sign Language as their first language. Some may have experienced partial or full hearing loss, and that could be referred to as deaf with a small d. And typically they would use lip reading, and they might speak and have some methods of communicating verbally. If we have a child or young person in our group who is deaf or has experienced partial or full hearing loss, how can we include them in our group more effectively? Again, here's 3 tips that you can have a look at. If they use sign language, then let's learn to sign and be able to communicate with them in their first language. That could be British Sign Language. Typically, that would be what they would learn if they were deaf from birth. But if they've lost some of their hearing or all of their hearing, they might have learned some Makaton. So we could learn that as a way of helping to communicate with them. Do they lip read? If they do, then make sure that we are making their ability to lip read as easy as possible. Don't stand in front of a window, because that puts shadow on your face. Don't put your hand over your mouth. Make sure they can see your face clearly so that they can lip read. Could we make what we do much more visual, using our visual sense, but also our other senses too, to help our communication to be more effective? The more multisensory we can be in our work with children and young people, whether they have additional needs or not, the better it is. To simulate partial hearing loss, we could use some ear defenders. It's always good to have ear defenders around for when there's loud noise for children and young people that find that difficult. Use some ear defenders to help children and young people understand what it might be like to have partial hearing loss or to be deaf. Get 2 of them to wear ear defenders and then ask them to have a quiet conversation. You'll find that they need to get louder and louder to be heard. and it helps them to understand a little bit about the world of their peers or leaders who may have hearing loss or are deaf. Jesus met a man near Decapolis who couldn't speak and was deaf. As far as we can tell, he was deaf from birth. And Jesus was brought this man, and there's no real knowledge as to whether the man himself was aware of what was going on. But Jesus decided to take him to a quiet place. Now, if we think about that for a moment, if Jesus had healed the man and given him his hearing for the first time in his life, with a huge crowd that would have been gathered round expectantly, waiting to see what Jesus would do, it would have been terrifying for the man. But Jesus took him to a quiet place. And so when he gave him his hearing and his ability to speak, the first thing that the man heard was the voice of Jesus. Jesus showed compassion and care and understanding of the man's needs. Again, some great learning that he passes on to us through that encounter. The third of our senses is our sense of smell, our olfactory sense. Again, there's some little pictures on the screen. We can see a nice smell, a flower, maybe a less nice smell with the dog poo in the background. But some, again, children or leaders can have an overdeveloped sense of smell, which means that when there are strong smells around them, they can experience sensory overload. This little character that's on the screen now is a character that we'll see a little bit more as we go through our session together. And it helps us to understand a little bit about sensory processing differences. Here, he's saying that he always smells people, food and objects. In his case, he's got an underdeveloped sense of smell. And he needs to keep sort of smelling and trying to understand what's going on through smell to get that sensory input that he's struggling to experience. Some children and young people will have either an undeveloped or an overdeveloped sense of smell, and that can lead to them having sensory processing difficulties. We'll explore more about that later. To help the children and young people in your group understand more about their sense of smell, you could get some essential oils. Maybe put a label over each one of them so that they don't know what they are, and get them to guess which is lavender, which is lemon balm. Try different scents and see if they can distinguish between them. You might try to get some stinky smells as well, perhaps some strong cheese or some old socks or something that's going to be an unpleasant smell. See if that helps them to understand a bit more about their sense of smell. Our Jesus story for our sense of smell was when Mary anointed Jesus's feet with pure nard, and the fragrance would have filled the whole house. It would have been an incredible smell. And I wonder, when we get this right with supporting children and young people with additional needs in our groups, in our churches, there's a pleasant scent to that too that fills our church and spreads across all areas of what we do in our church ministry. Our fourth sense that we're going to explore is our sense of taste, our gustatory sense. Again, there are some graphics on the screen to help you think about all the different kinds of taste sensations that we might have. Some children or young leaders may not like certain tastes. They might resist them, especially strong tastes, or some may seek out certain flavours. Some children and young people might put non-food items in their mouth. That's a condition called pica. And of course, we need to be super vigilant if we have a child or young person with pica in our group, because there can be choke hazards or maybe what they're eating is going to make them ill. So, our sense of taste can be quite important to us in that regard as well. Here's our little sensory processing differences guy again, and a couple of things that he's got to say to us. One is that he's a picky eater and resists new foods and textures. So he may have an overdeveloped sense of taste, and so many taste sensations can be too much for him. They can be overpowering, so he's quite choosy about the things that he eats and has only certain foods that he will tolerate. Alternatively, he may chew on everything. He may put everything in his mouth, all sorts of food, but also non-food items as well. So he may have an overdeveloped or an underdeveloped sense of taste, and that can present itself through different sensory processing differences as well. To test our sense of taste, we can get some sweets in. We could get some sour sweets, some sugary sweets, maybe some unusual sweets like some salted licorice pretzels. Often, if I'm running this session in building for a group, I'll take tubs of sweets with me, and the sweet pythons get eaten very quickly. Quite a few people will have a go at the giant sour suckers. Um, Only the brave go for the salted licorice pretzels. It's quite an acquired taste. But yeah, try some different taste sensations with the children and young people to get them to understand a bit more about that. And of course, Jesus said that believers are the salt of the earth. We're all the salt of the earth if we put our trust and belief in Him. And again, in doing that and helping the children and young people that we journey with to do that as well, then that salt, which of course brings flavour to the things that we eat, but in this case brings flavour to the world through the presence of believers in the world, making a real difference and bringing others to know Jesus as their Saviour is really important. The fifth of our better known senses is our sense of touch, our tactile sense. Again, there's a little graphic there that can help you to understand a bit more about how we use that. So many different ways that our sense of touch is used and is valuable to us. Again, we might have some leaders or children and young people who have either an underdeveloped or an overdeveloped sense of touch. And that can bring itself out again in different parts of sensory processing differences. Here's our little character again, and this time he's telling us that he seems to be unaware of normal touch or pain. In other words, he's got an underdeveloped sense of touch, and so if he hurts himself, for example, he's not aware of it. We need to be really careful about that. Particularly if we're thinking about doing some cooking. We might be using a knife, we might be using a hot stove. Those can be dangerous things at the best of times, but particularly if you're not aware that you've hurt yourself. But other children, young people may have an overdeveloped sense of touch. They might touch others too soft or too hard. And so there can be all sorts of nuances to our sense of touch and whether it's under or overdeveloped as part of sensory processing differences. Exploring our sense of touch, we can use a variety of things. Here we're using some gunge or jelly bath to plunge hands into. It's a really sensory, tactile sensation. Similarly, some water beads that we can fill a bucket of. And again, children and young people love to put their hands into the bucket and get that touch sensation from playing with the water beads. Or maybe we could provide some therapy or some Play-Doh for them to squish and squeeze and get a touch sensation from that. Get them to explore their sense of touch as part of them understanding themselves and understanding their bodies. Of course, Jesus met many people in his time on earth, and sometimes he just said a word. And that was enough for them to be healed. Sometimes they didn't even have to be in front of him. But here he met a man with leprosy. And of course, the one thing you never did when you met somebody with leprosy was to touch them. That was very dangerous. Leprosy is an awful thing for somebody to have now. 2,000 years ago, it was a death sentence. And so the last thing you did was to touch someone. But Jesus met a man with leprosy and he reached out and touched him to heal him. Now, Jesus didn't need to do that. He could have just said the word and the man would have been healed. So why did he touch him? I wonder if Jesus realized that this man, because of his leprosy, hadn't had the touch of another human being for a very long time. And so, in reaching out and touching him, Jesus didn't just heal him physically, but he healed him mentally, emotionally, in every way, and fully healed the man. And it was, yeah, just a wonderful experience for the man, not just to be released from this dreadful condition of leprosy, but to feel the touch of another human being for the first time in a very long time. So, as we come towards the end of this first session, we've covered our five better known senses of sight and hearing and smell and touch and taste. What does that mean for you? Maybe as a family member, perhaps you journey with a child or young person as a family member who has a sensory sensitivity or a sensory impairment or a lack of use of one of their senses. Or maybe as a church member, perhaps you're involved in children's, youth, and families work and you journey with children and young people for whom this is relevant. Perhaps you do schools work, whatever your context, have a think about what we've learned so far. What might you do differently as a result of the information that we've explored so far? And what might you think differently as a result of that information as well? How has it changed your understanding of our five senses that we've explored up until this point? When you've had a think about that, take a break and then we'll move on to our next session where we'll be exploring three of our mystery senses. Welcome back. I hope you had a good break, and we're now going to move on into session two, looking at some of the mystery senses that we may know less about. We're going to start by thinking about our vestibular sense. Our vestibular sense is our sense of balance and movement. And as you can see from the graphic on the screen, it helps us to do things like knowing what way up we are. That's quite an important thing for us to know, isn't it? Whether we are stood still or moving, how gravity has an impact on us, and how to be able to stand in a position without falling over. Those are really quite important things for us to do. And so our vestibular sense is one that we use all the time. But we don't always think about in the same way as some of the five senses that we looked at in session one. You can see on the graphic here, the girl is using her vestibular sense in lots of different ways. Think about some of the ways that you use your vestibular sense on a day-to-day basis. Here we've got a little image, a cartoon, where the elephant's fallen over on its back. And the vet says it may be his inner ear. Our inner ear is connected very much to our vestibular sense. Sometimes if you have an inner ear infection, it can make you feel unbalanced. You can feel giddy. And it can be hard to move around when you've got an inner ear infection. Sometimes we may have an under-responsive or hyposensitive vestibular system. And that means that we might need to move constantly to get the sensory input that we need. Think about a child or young person that can't sit still, that has to get up and move around a lot. That could be that they're responding to an under-responsive, hyposensitive vestibular system. Or a child or young person may have an overly responsive or hypersensitive vestibular system, which can mean that they can be fearful of movement. It might make them feel unbalanced or unwell, or it may mean that they fall. Another example might be a child or young person who struggles when you are going somewhere on a coach or in a car. They get travel sick. That can be an indication of an overly responsive, hypersensitive vestibular system. A child or a young person who has an under-responsive or hyposensitive vestibular system that needs that sense of movement that they're craving, they might find it easier to use a wobble cushion or to sit on an exercise ball. That way they can get the movement that they need without necessarily having to be always getting up and moving around. As we'll see later, it can also be helpful to take activity breaks, and that can give children and young people with an under-responsive vestibular system an opportunity to get that movement that they're looking for. But think about ways to build that movement in so that they can be sat on something like a wobble cushion or a gym ball and get the movement they need when they're sat at a table and doing some work or sat listening to a talk that you're giving to them. What about Jesus and his vestibular system? Well, when Jesus and the disciples were on the boat in the middle of Galilee, when the storm came up and the boat was being tossed around everywhere, then the disciples were scared, and some of these men were sailors, were fishermen, and they were used to rough conditions on the lake, but yet they were scared of the conditions. It must have been pretty bad. It must have given everybody a good vestibular workout. If you've ever been on a rough sea in a boat, then you know how hard it can be to cope with that, and often we can feel seasick. Jesus woke and stilled the storm. And I'm sure that the disciples were thrilled because they were saved from what was happening with the storm, but also they could calm their vestibular systems down. They wouldn't have understood what that meant, but at least they could stop feeling seasick quite so much as perhaps they'd been feeling. The next of our mystery senses is proprioception. Proprioception is our sense of body awareness, where our body is positioned in our environment or space, and also how much force we use when we are picking something up or opening a door, for example, the amount of effort that we need to apply. Now, to have a little experiment here, if you want to do this, then close your eyes and then put your finger on the end of your nose. And then open your eyes again, and hopefully your finger will have made it to the end of your nose. You can take your finger away now, but just think about how complicated that actually was. You did it quite naturally. You did it without being able to see the end of your nose, but yet you were able to send signals from your brain down through your head, your neck, your shoulder, your arm, your elbow, through to your wrist, to your hand, to your fingers. And your hand was able to guide your finger directly to the tip of your nose, something you couldn't see, but that your body knew where it was. That's proprioception in action. In all of our joints and muscles, there are sensors, receptors that are sending information to our brain and receiving information back from our brain to help us to know where our body is in space and to help us to move and to coordinate our movement. Here's another little cartoon to help illustrate the theme. It sort of mixes up proprioception and vestibular senses. The little guy here says, "I wish I had a sixth sense." And Fraz says, "Well, there's proprioception. That's your awareness of your body's balance and position." So it's mixing up a couple of those senses. Some say that's a sixth sense. The kid says, "Forget that. I just want to read people's minds." And Fraz said, oh, they'd be thinking, why does that kid keep falling down? Because, both our vestibular and proprioceptive senses work together to help us to stay upright. Whenever we go upstairs, carry something, stand up, sit down, bend over, stretch, we're using our proprioceptive system. If you've got something near you, like a pen or a piece of paper, pick that up. That proprioceptive system is telling your body, your hand, how much force you need to use to pick that item up. Now, if you had a box of 1,000 pens or a pack of 1,000 sheets of paper, your brain would tell your hand that you needed to use a lot more force, a lot more effort to be able to pick that box of pens or that box of paper up. And so you would use far more force than just for one pen or one piece of paper. That's proprioception again, helping our body to understand the amount of force or effort to use. If we want to help our children and young people to respond to their proprioceptive sense, then providing physical activities through activity breaks can help them to meet those sensory needs. That's particularly helpful if we're going to ask them to sit and do some work around a table, or we want them to sit and listen to a talk for a while. Anything that is going to be a more sedentary, calm activity. Before that, get them to get some movement in. Could be a little walk around the building or even around the room. Could be doing some stretching exercises. Could be just giving them some Play-Doh or Theraputty to squeeze, but something that helps to wake their bodies up, to help them to be able to activate their bodies, then helps them when they're going to be sitting and thinking or listening for a while. And then after that thinking or sitting or listening for a while, give them another activity break then. So intersperse different things that you're doing that might be more sort of sitting and listening activities with active participation activities, a bit of a walk, a stretch, and so on. Mixing those up will help children and young people to cope much better and get a much better experience of the session that you're running for them. Of course, Jesus walked everywhere. A couple of times he went by donkey, but most of the time Jesus walked with his disciples. We learned earlier about Bartimaeus and his place just outside of Jericho, and Jesus was heading back to Jerusalem, walking past him. Jesus often walked from place to place, but he also often, before he was going to pray, would walk to a quiet place, sometimes up a mountain. Jesus understood that he needed to use his body to get an activity break in before something that was really critical and important, like prayer, or before he was going to perform some significant miracles. And so, if Jesus understood this stuff, then it's something that we should understand about ourselves and about the children and young people that we're journeying with as well. The third of our mystery senses is interoception. And interoception, as you can see from the graphic, is all about what's going on inside of our bodies. Just like with proprioception, there are sensors, receptors in all of our muscles and joints. So there are those sensors and receptors in all the organs of our body, including the skin, which is an organ as well. And that's sending and receiving information to and from our brain all the time, and helping us to understand about our bodies and what's going on inside of our bodies all of the time. Of course, all this happens subconsciously. We're not aware of it, but it's vitally important to us that our brain understands what's going on in our body and can alert us if there's something wrong, for example. It might help us to understand if we're getting too hot or too cold, or if we're hungry or thirsty. Or if we need something to eat, perhaps, or we might have a bit of a digestive problem, or if our heart rate is too high. Some children and young people may struggle to regulate their interoceptive sense. They might have an underdeveloped interoceptive sense, and so may not be aware that actually they're getting cold. You might see a child or young person in the middle of winter on a cold day going around in a t-shirt. That might be because they've got an underdeveloped interoceptive sense. Similarly, in the middle of summer, getting too hot, still with a coat on, when actually they should be taking that coat off. Some children and young people may not be aware that they're hungry and thirsty, so we need to make sure that they're getting snacks and a drink to make sure that that's working for them. But also another area of interoception can be that interoception tells us when we need to go to the toilet. So a child or young person with an underdeveloped interoceptive sense may not be aware that they need to go to the toilet until it's too late. Somebody I know who's an accomplished international speaker has an underdeveloped interoceptive sense, and her body doesn't tell her that she needs to go to the toilet. So she has a watch with an alarm on it, and when the alarm goes, she needs to then go and find a toilet to make sure that she doesn't have an accident. Really important that we're understanding how interoception is vital for ourselves and the children and young people we're journeying with. Here, our little cartoon is a character that says, "My gut instinct turned out to be indigestion." Yeah, indigestion can be another aspect of interoception as well. Here again, just a reminder of some of the things that we need to encourage young people and children to think about and to help them and equip them about when we're making sure they're responding to their interoceptive sense. Giving toilet breaks, making sure that particularly children and young people with an underdeveloped interoceptive sense are going to the toilet. Help them to manage how much to eat and drink. They may not feel hungry, but they will be hungry. They may not feel thirsty, but it's a hot, sunny day. So we may need to make sure they keep their fluids up. They may not feel hot or cold, but we want to make sure that they're appropriately dressed, especially if we're taking them out to the church garden or we're going on a trip, making sure that if it's middle of winter, they've got a coat and they're wearing it and keeping warm, because their bodies may not be giving them that information. What about Jesus and his interoceptive sense? Well, Jesus experienced many strong senses and emotions and feelings through the 3 years of his ministry on earth. Of course, when he spent those 40 days and 40 nights in the wilderness, he hungered as he was tempted by the devil to turn rocks into bread to eat, and he successfully overcame that temptation. But hunger is an interoceptive sense, an interoceptive response. Those strong emotions of the Garden of Gethsemane, again, those were very real and come from that interoceptive input that his body would be experiencing, and then thirst that he experienced on the cross. And again, thirst is an interoceptive response as well. Lots going on in our bodies that we may not fully understand. But those three senses that we've just explored together are absolutely critical for us in understanding children and young people that we are journeying with, how they are responding to their senses. So pause for a moment and have a think about what we've learned in that session 2. How is this relevant for you? Again, perhaps as a family member or as a church member, somebody who's journeying with children and young people with different additional needs and disabilities, and who sensory aspects of that are significant. What might you think differently as a result of the information we've looked at so far? What might you do differently as a result of that information? So take a pause for a few moments, have a think about that, make some notes about things that you're going to do as a result of what we've learned together. And then when you've done that, have a sensory break yourself. Get up, have a bit of a stretch, go and get a drink, respond to your interoceptive senses. And then when you're ready, we can move on into our final session, session 3, where we'll be looking at sensory processing differences and then giving you the opportunity to explore some case studies together. Welcome back. Hopefully you've enjoyed that sensory break. You've got some stretching in, you've got a drink, and you're ready for our final session to explore together. In our final session, we're going to be focusing on sensory processing difficulties or differences. This is sometimes called sensory processing or sensory integration, and it's a term that refers to the way that the body receives and interprets messages from all the senses that we've been exploring so far in this program and more. Again, as we've said earlier, it usually occurs unconsciously without any effort on our behalf. But sometimes we can have an under or overdeveloped sense or several senses, and that can cause sensory processing difficulties or differences for us. We've got another little guy on the screen here, and you can see some of the things that he is sharing with us, things that we picked up in earlier parts of our program. He likes to smell people, food, or objects. He can touch others too soft or too hard. He can cannot tolerate certain textiles or tags on his clothing. But then there are other things that we've picked up on as well, like he likes to chew on different materials and textiles. He may have pica as part of his sensory makeup there. He can be oversensitive to loud noise, such as blenders or car horns. So there's lots going on here. Maybe as you look at some of the things that little character is sharing with us, that might be recognizable in some of the children and young people that you are journeying with, and help you to understand them a little bit better. A child with sensory processing difficulties can have reactions and responses to those difficulties, which can be very difficult for us to understand and often very difficult for them to explain. They can enter into that fight, flight, or freeze mode that can often and wrongly be interpreted as bad behavior. I heard a story of a child who didn't develop speech until he was about 8 years old. And often in the family home, he would be in the kitchen dining area, and whilst there, would suddenly scream and go running from the room, or would collapse in a heap on the floor and put his arms around his head. And he wasn't able to communicate why that was happening until he was at least 8 and speech had developed for him. Nobody could understand what was going on. At first, his parents thought he was just being badly behaved, he was attention seeking or something. Medical professionals were unable to figure out what was happening. But later, when he was able to communicate verbally, he was able to share with his family that it was the fridge that was the problem. When the fridge switched on, if he was in the kitchen at that moment, it was like somebody taking a drill to his head. It was overwhelming and painful. If he could get out of the room, he would. But sometimes it overwhelmed him before he could do that. And all he could do was collapse to the floor and wrap his arms around his head and his ears. And he was, really struggling and in pain. And of course, children, young people with sensory processing difficulties can feel anxious and overwhelmed about those sensory sensations they're feeling. It can make them feel depressed. They can be really low because of how day-to-day things can be really difficult. I've heard time and time again that fluorescent tubes, for example, can be a real problem. Not only are they very bright, but also they have a little starter motor in which buzzes. And that can be a real problem for a child or a young person with a sensory processing difficulty as well. As a consequence of these struggles that they might experience, they may appear aggressive, but actually, again, it's that fight, flight, freeze mode that they're experiencing, and understanding that this is a real struggle for them. It's not a behavioural issue; it's actually a sensory issue. Helps us to understand them better. Helps us to be able to help them better, as we can perhaps give them some support and help regarding their sensory processing difficulties. But also it means that we can think about the environment that we're bringing them into. Is it one that works for them? Is it one that's helpful for them? Children, young people with sensory processing difficulties often present in one of three ways. They can overreact. An example of overreacting on the little graphic in front of you is that a child may cover their ears when there's loud noise, such as a vacuum cleaner or a hairdryer, for example. They may scream or cry. It's overwhelming. It's painful. It's incredibly intense, what they're experiencing. And so, it may seem like a a big reaction to a noise that many people can tolerate. But for them, it's incredibly painful and difficult for them to experience. They might be sensory seeking. Sensory seeking might be a child or young person who is a excessive risk taker, a child who bangs into things on purpose, bangs into people on purpose. Sometimes we call them bumpers and crashes because that's what they do, and they're constantly trying to get that sensory input that their bodies crave. It's helping them to activate their sense of touch, but it's also utilizing their vestibular and proprioceptive senses of their position in space, their body awareness, their sense of balance. But then there will be children, young people who underreact. Here we've got a child or young person who has little or no reaction to pain. They might burn themselves, they might cut themselves, but not respond as you might expect. Similarly, they may not respond to being too hot or too cold. So sensory processing differences can be wide and different in the way that children and young people experience them. And they won't just experience them in one way. They may overreact in some scenarios and underreact in others. It's important to understand their whole sensory makeup and their whole sensory profile in order for us to be able to support them better and help them to understand themselves, but also for us to be able to understand them and make sure that what we're doing in our group, in our setting, is supportive of them. Practice reading the clues and thinking about the sensory qualities of each thing that we're doing and each place that we're bringing that child or young person into. If we're seeing them overreacting, if we're seeing them underreacting, if we're seeing them sensory seeking, then that gives us clues about what we need to change in our setting. Is the activity or the location that we're using resulting in a child responding in one of those ways? Are there things that we can then change to help them and to regulate their senses better? Is the environment that we're bringing them into calming, or is it stimulating? Which of those do we need it to be to support them best? Can we change what we're doing to make that environment one that works better for them? If we can't change the environment, is there an opt-out? Is there a sensory space that we can offer that provides that safety, that calm space that they may be craving, whilst the other activity is happening? It could be, for example, that a sensory stimulating activity like football is happening. Loads of children running around, ball flying around and hitting people, people crashing into each other and falling over. That can be a difficult environment for some children, young people with a sensory processing difference. So is there a calmer space that they could use, or a role that they could have that doesn't mean that they're running around and crashing into people and falling over? Perhaps if they've got an overdeveloped vestibular sense of balance and movement, that might be really hard for them. So could they be the referee, the scorer, somebody that's helping to prepare the snacks and drinks? There's different roles that we could identify where they could still be a part of what's going on, but not necessarily being exposed to the sensory challenges that they might otherwise face. Are we equipping them to cope, or are we setting them up to fail? There's a real difference between the two, isn't there? Have a think about that when putting activities together and thinking about the individual children and young people that you journey with. Remember those activity breaks that we touched on earlier, sometimes called sensory diets. They can really help. So again, make sure you're building those in to your program and have those activity breaks in place before you get them to think about something or respond to a talk that you've given or to listen to that talk. Put a sensory activity break in there first, and then after that thinking, listening, writing activity, whatever it might be, give them another sensory activity break then to wake their senses up once more before you go on to whatever might be coming next. Having looked at the eight senses that we've been exploring in this program, as well as getting a better understanding of sensory processing differences or disorder, there's now an opportunity for you to have a look at some case studies. In your workbook, towards the end of your workbook, you'll find that there are 5 different case studies that you can have a look at. What I would encourage you to do is to choose one, have a good look at the information that's there, and then think about what changes can we put in place to better support that child or young person. How can we bring about an environment that is supportive of them, an environment where they're set up to succeed and not being set up to fail? You can have a look at as many or as few of these as you would like to, but have a look at least one and put into practice some of the things that we've been learning during this module. I would encourage you to write up as many ideas as you can. Put a big list of things together that you could put in place. Of course, if we were doing this for real with actual children and young people, we'd be working through this with them and with their families, because it's always important to do inclusion with people and not unto them. It's all about doing inclusion as a journey together. But we can't do that. These are fictitious case study scenarios. So have a look at the scenario that most appeals to you and come up with as many ideas as you can. When you've done that, then think about what 2 or 3 ideas you could start with, because we wouldn't want to put all of those ideas in place together. Doing that could itself be overwhelming for a child or young person. Too much change, too much that's different. And so have that big list of ideas, but then together with them, typically if we're doing this for real, and with their families, identify 2 or 3 things that are quick wins that you could do this week. Things that are really easy to put in place that would make a difference. Let those settle in for a couple of weeks, then bring in maybe 2 or 3 more. And bit by bit, introduce the ideas that you have come up with together. That does 2 things for us. First of all, it doesn't overwhelm that child or young person. It gives them the opportunity to acclimatise to the changes that we're introducing. That's a much better experience for them. But it also means that we can measure which of those ideas is working and maybe which aren't. You might try 3 ideas, 2 of them will work brilliantly, but one doesn't work in the way that you hoped it would with that particular child or young person. If you've only introduced 2 or 3 ideas at a time, it's much easier for us to measure success or otherwise of those ideas. If you throw 12 ideas into the mix together, we've got no way of knowing really what's worked and what hasn't. So have a look at the case study and just spend a bit of time exploring how to make a difference for that particular child or young person. I hope you found those case studies helpful. You've got 5 to continue to look at, so maybe work through all of them as a real practice before you do this for real with the children and young people and families that you're journeying with. With better understanding about our senses and about sensory processing difficulties or differences, and the right strategies in place to support children and young people to understand their senses better, but for us to understand how those senses are relevant for each child and young person we're journeying with, then we can learn to make all that they do and that we do inclusive for every child and young person. I hope that as we've explored making sense of our senses together, it's taught you something about your own sensory makeup. Maybe you've identified senses that are underdeveloped or overdeveloped for you. Explore that further and think about that in your own context, but also think about the children and young people you journey with and what their sensory profile might be too. If you've got any questions or you want to follow up on anything that we've been looking at as we've gone through this module today, making sense of our senses, then do be in touch. I would love to hear from you. My email address is on the screen, so contact me and yeah, ask me any questions that you've got. Or if you'd like to have a chat about anything that we've explored in this module in more detail, then reach out and we can arrange to jump on a Teams or a Zoom call or a phone call to unpack some of what we've been talking about in this session in a bit more detail. Of course, you've got your workbook to refer to as well, and that's packed with even more information that helps you to understand a bit more about our senses and how to make sense of them. Thanks for being here for this module. I look forward to seeing you on future modules on the Additional Needs Practitioner self-paced program. Bye for now.